All right, welcome to the Empire in Transition. Now, at the last PowerPoint or lecture, we discussed really what did culture and society look like in the colonial era, the really the 17th and really the beginning of the 18th century. Today, we're going to look at some of the events that kind of push the American colonists to towards independence. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Now, when you look at really how did the revolutionary thoughts and actions begin, it really had been coming for a long time. And they emerged because of two reasons. The first reason is a decentralized empire. A decentralized empire. Now, in the 50 years after the Glorious Revolution, the English Parliament is going to make a growing supremacy over the king. The Prime Minister and his cabinet members become the nation's real executives because they depended politically on the great merchants and landlords of England, and they were less inclined than previous monarchs to hold firm control over the empires, which many merchants feared would disrupt profitable commerce within the colonies. So the empire became loose and decentralized and ineffective. The British Empire at this stage is spreading and it's getting huge. The quote that the sun does not set on the British Empire really starts around Queen Elizabeth's time, and we're a little bit after that. And so the British Empire is decentralized. There's not one really hub. There's just a bunch of hubs. And another reason, the second reason, is the colonies are divided. Now, even though the colonies had the same enemies like the French, the colonists saw themselves as separate, yet they're all Englishmen, they're all English women and children. So if you are from Virginia, you are from the Virginia colony. And if you are from Maryland, you are from the Maryland colony. So that's why when the revolution breaks out, the British, those that are actually in the British government abroad, are really surprised about the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution because they did not see all the colonists working together. That was just culturally not happening at this time. And so if you are a colonist at this time, you are really struggling to really find yourself and your voice. And there's various wars in the 17th and 18th centuries that really start to become a thorn in the side of these colonists. And one of them is going to be the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Now, the French and Indian War is from the 1750s to the 1760s. And this is the British victory confirms England's commercial supremacy and cemented its control in North America. Now it is important to address that New France, right? So that large territory that makes up really a third of North America is really what it looks like for the French Empire within North America. And New France is really good at cementing its relationship with the Iroquois nation. And so by the end of the 17th century, the French Empire in North America is huge. The whole length of the Mississippi River and its delta, and it goes as far west as the Rocky Mountains, as far south as the Rio Grande River, and France is going to claim the entire interior of North America. Now, France is going to establish a strong really a string of widely separated communities, fortresses, missions, and trading posts. Okay, they're not going to be having a huge amount of people populating that area. And so the French and the English knew that the empire that could control the continent of North America came down to who could win the allegiance of the native tribes. Now, the English could offer the Native Americans better and more plentiful goods. However, the French offered tolerance, in that the English would try to change how the Native Americans lived, their culture, their society. The French would not. The French would tolerate and they would embrace the Native Americans' culture, languages, customs. And so the French adjusted their living patterns to that of the Native Americans. For example, fur traders, French fur traders married Native Americans and adopted their ways. You can even look at Jesuit missionaries. And so by the mid-18th century, the French had a better and closer relations with the Native Americans than the English. And so the most powerful native group within this area is going to be the Iroquois Confederacy, and it's going to consist of 5 Indian nations. So you have the Mohawk, you have the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida. And they formed a defense alliance in the 15th century. They traded with both the French and the English, and they played them against each other. They had their own documents, their own alliances. They were really well organized. Now, there's also going to be 3 European wars that are European but on American soil that are really going to start to really push the American colonists. And so you have King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. And I'm going to briefly describe what those are. They're briefly described in the slides prior to the one we are on. So if you want that information, it is on 2 slides ago. So King William's War is from 1689 to 1697, and it produced a few really clash between the English and the French within northern New England. Now, when you look at Queen Anne's War, that is between 1701 and 1713, and it's going to result in a treaty that is going to transfer substantial territory from the French to the English in North America, including Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And lastly, we have King George's War, which is from 1744 to 1748. Now, King George's War was with disputes over British trading rights in the Spanish colonies between England and Spain. The English colonists were drawn into the struggle, and New Englanders captured the French bastion in Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. However, the peace treaty forced them to abandon it. And so after this war, the relationships between the English, the French, and the Iroquois quickly deteriorate. The Iroquois granted major concessions in the interior to the English, which is huge, right? And so the French feared that the English were using the concessions to expand into the interior. And so they built more fortresses in the Ohio Valley. And so the English increased their military forces and fortresses in the Ohio Valley as well. And so tensions between the French and the English are going to just increase and increase and increase. And in the summer of 1754, the governor of Virginia is going to send a militia force, which included a very young and a very inexperienced George Washington, which is the picture on this slide on the left, to the Ohio Valley to challenge French expansion. Now, Washington is going to build a stockade called Fort Necessity, not far from Francis Fort, near modern-day Pittsburgh. And after the Virginians staged an unsuccessful attack on a French detachment, the French attacked Fort Necessity, trapping Washington and his men inside. Now, 1/3 of those Englishmen trapped inside are going to die in the fighting. Washington is going to surrender, and this marked the start of the French and Indian War. This war is going to last for roughly 9 years. And there's a few phases of the war that I want to discuss. The first phase is going to be the Fort Necessity debacle in 1754 until the expansion of the war to Europe in 1756. It was really primarily a closed North American conflict until that year, 1756. The Iroquois are going to remain largely passive in the war. However, almost all of the tribes remained allies with the French. However, almost all other tribes remained allies with the French, except for the Iroquois. They're going to launch raids on the Western English settlements, and by 1755, many English settlers along the frontier have moved to the east of the Allegheny Mountains. And by 1755, many English settlers along the frontier had moved to the east of the Allegheny Mountains, Allegheny, to escape the fighting. And this is what incorporates the first phase. Now, if you look at this slide, that little picture on the top right, that is what Fort Necessity looks like. It was not this huge dominant fortress. And the picture on the bottom right is a drawing of what Fort Necessity looked like. All right, so let's look at phase 2. Phase 2 is going to begin in 1756 when the war transfers over to Europe. And it's going to spread to the West Indies, to India and Europe. And in 1757, you're going to have William Pitt, the English Secretary of State, brought the war fully under British control. He is going to plan the military strategy. He's going to appoint commanders, and he's going to issue orders to the colonists. Commanders enlisted colonists into the army. Officers will seize supplies from local farmers and tradesmen and compel colonists to offer shelter to British soldiers. Now, the colonists began to resent the commanders, and friction started between England and the colonies, simply because the colonists have no say on whether the army comes in and takes supplies that they need. And finally, we're going to talk about the third and final phase of the French and Indian War. Now, this is really the outcome of the French and Indian War. And most of these policies, the colonists are going to find very obnoxious. So, what did these colonists have to do? Well, they had, well, not really what the colonists had to do, but what really what did Pitt had to do for the colonists. He agreed in the third and final phase to reimburse the colonists for supplies that the army took. He returned control over recruitment to colonial assemblies, so that means that the local governments were now in control of recruitment. And he also dispatched large troops of additional British troops to North America, to those colonists, which is going to be very interesting just to see how this is going to resonate with those colonists. And so in 1763, you're going to have the Peace of Paris. In this document, the French are going to cede to Great Britain some of their West Indian islands, most of their colonies in India and Canada, and all other French territory in North America east of the Mississippi River. Now, the French gave New Orleans and their claims west of the Mississippi River to Spain, surrendering all title to the mainland of America. So they're losing a ton of space, a ton of resources. But the French are really broke and poor. So now we're going to look at the cost of the war. So it is going to enlarge Britain's debt and largely increase British resentment of the colonists. There's going to be tensions between the empire and her colonies that begin to grow extremely big. They were upset. Now, they were upset with the colonists because they made so few financial contributions to the war, because they believed it was for the colonists' benefit. And so there's going to be this bitter resentment between the British citizens abroad, outside of the American colonies, and those British colonists. They're going to be bitter that the colonial merchants had been selling food and other goods to the French in the West Indies during the war, and all of these factors are going to persuade the English leaders that a reorganization of the empire was extremely necessary, including an increased authority over the colonies, which is not going to sit well with the colonists, as we are going to see. So this picture really just shows you, after the Peace of Paris, what land does Great Britain hold? So virtually there is no New France anymore after the Treaty of Paris, or the Peace of Paris, which is extremely significant. All right, so we're going to continue on, and we're going to talk about new imperialism. Okay, so the British Empire has a ton of debt from previous wars and is in desperate need of new revenues, new ways to make money. And so they are responsible for these new lands in North America because of the Peace of Paris. So they believe that they need to increase its administrative capabilities in North America and create a dramatic and really disastrous redefinition of the colonial relationship. And so first we're going to look at the burdens of the empire. We're going to look at debt. Okay, so landlords and merchants in England were opposing further tax increases, and the colonial assemblies had repeatedly showed their unwillingness to pay for the war effort, mostly because a lot of them did not vote for it. So why pay for something you don't want? And so many officials believed that the only way to pay was by taxing the colonists directly could the empire effectively meet its financial needs. And so at this time, who is sitting on the throne is going to be George III. Now, he was determined to reassert the authority of the monarchy. He removed from power the relatively stable coalition of Whigs that had governed for much of the century and replaced it with a new and unstable coalition of his own. Now, George III was sick and suffered from serious intellectual and psychological limitations. He had a rare mental disease where he had bouts of insanity. Now, although most of the time he was lucid and he acted extremely immature and insecure when he wasn't going through a mishap. And so he attributed the instability, he's really known for being the cause of the instability of the British Empire. So when you don't have good leaders, when you don't have good leadership, it's going to drastically affect the country, a business, you name it, whatever small, big scale you're on. And so there's just a lot of hardships that are happening in the British Empire at this time, in the 1760s. And so George III is going to make George Grenville Prime Minister in 1763. Now, he believed that the colonists should be compelled to pay a part of the cost of defending and administering the empire. And so they created certain taxes that would be on the colonists, but it's also important that they also created some taxes that were on everyone, not just the colonists. That's important to realize. And at the same time, the British are trying to create boundaries with the Native Americans. However, the British settlers, the colonists, continue to push further into the Native American land when they're not supposed to. Continuously, almost like poking the bear. Just wait for that bear to react. So the Native Americans see it as the British colonists are not obeying their word, but these colonists are not the ones signing the documents, so a lot of times they don't know. So there's just a lot of miscommunication. So what does the Greenfield Ministry do to try to increase its authority within the colonies? Well, there's going to be various acts. The first one is going to be the Mutiny Act of 1765, which is on the slide, which stated colonists were required to help provide and maintain the army. Now, ships were off the coast to patrol American waters for smugglers, and royal officers were required to take up their colonial post in person instead of just sending in substitutes. Colonial manufacturing was restricted so that it would not compete with rapidly expanding industries in Great Britain. So that's all within the Mutiny Act of 1765. You also have the Sugar Act of 1764, which raised the duty on sugar while lowering the duty on molasses. And lastly, you're going to have the Currency Act of 1764, which is going to require the colonial assemblies to stop issuing paper money. So most colonists found ways to live within these British laws. However, frictions continued between the colonists and the British government because the colonists believed in self-government. They believed that colonial assemblies had the sole right to control the costs of government within the colonies. By attempting to raise extensive revenues directly from the public, the British government was challenging the basis of colonial political power. And it's only going to get worse with the more taxes that the British government are going to impose on the colonists, but not just the colonists, all British citizens. And so the first of this that is really going to kind of stir up this idea of revolting is going to be the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765, which is a tax on printed documents, which is going to fall on all people because this is a tax on newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, deeds, wills, licenses, etc. And the British begin to collect 10 times more than they were previously collecting in 1763, 2 years prior. So in the past, taxes and duties on colonial trade had always been designed to regulate commerce. However, this act was an attempt to raise revenue from the colonies without the consent of the colonial assemblies. Now, one of the outcries from this act is going to be Patrick Henry, which I'm going to post his speech that you'll listen to. And he's going to make a dramatic speech to the House in May of 1765 in Virginia, demanding that the colonists be treated like the English, especially the right to be taxed only by their own representatives, and that Virginians should not tax except those voted on by the Virginia Assembly, and that anyone advocating the right of Parliament to tax Virginians should be deemed an enemy of the colony. So pretty much they want no taxation without representation. They don't want to be taxed without being able to vote on it. Their local governments, their even regional governments. They don't want to be told, hey, you have to do this tax without having a word in or an opinion in the matter. And so mobs are going to start to meet who are against the act. And the largest was in Boston, where men belonging to a group known as the Sons of Liberty are going to start terrorizing state agents and burning those stamps. Now let's look at the Boston Massacre. So the Boston Massacre is going to be March 5th, 1770. And it's when a mob of dock workers, known as the Liberty Boys and others, began throwing rocks and snowballs at the Custom House. Now, Captain Thomas Preston of the British Regiment lined up several of his men in front of the building to protect it. There was some scaffolding, a soldier was knocked down, probably by a rock or a snowball, and several British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. Now, the soldiers that were tried before a Boston jury, all men, were found guilty of manslaughter and were given the token punishment. And the leading figure in provoking the outrage was Samuel Adams. Now, the colonists believed that adopting the English Constitution was the best system ever created because the government could be led by a corrupt leader. The people needed safeguards against its possible abuses of power. So if your leader ended up being corrupt, well, at least you have these policies to kind of check and balance each other to make sure that those who are found guilty were held according to their crime. Now, the English distribution of power was among 3 elements of society: the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the common people. Now, the English political system ensured that no individual or group could exercise unchecked authority. No taxation without representation, right? So since the colonies had none of their own representatives in Parliament, it followed that they were not represented there. Colonists believed that the colonial assemblies played the same role within the colonies as Parliament did within England. Now, the empire, the colonists believed, was a sort of federation of commonwealths, each with its own legislation body, and all tied together by loyalty to the king. However, the British believed in one authority, Parliament or the king, no state legislator. So this is going to continue to be an issue that the colonists are going to have to deal with and be frustrated with as well. Now, I wanted to show you this picture on the left. So this is another example of propaganda within a colonial newspaper. Now, if you look at this, you have the men all lined up, the British Army all lined up in their red coats on the right-hand side, and then you have the colonists on the left-hand side being shot and killed. Now, it's important to realize that, yes, the army was lined up in front of the house, but if you look at their stance, they look very aggressive, intentionally killing these colonists, and the colonists are seen more as helpless. And it's important to put that out because, as you can see, we're still seeing propaganda even in the 18th century. So let's continue on and look at more acts that just start to rally up these colonists. And the next one is really the one that really just pushes them over. And that is going to be with the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is the Tea Act of 1773. Now, on the verge of bankruptcy, the East India Company had large amounts of tea that it could not sell in England. So the tax on tea, so they decided to tax tea in the new colonies. And this act is going to give the company the right to export its merchandise directly to the colonies without paying any of the regular taxes that were imposed on colonial merchants, who had traditionally served as the middlemen between these transactions. And so the company could undersell colonial merchants and monopolize the colonial tea trade. Now, the result of this is you're going to have very angry colonists that deemed that this act was unconstitutional, that the colonists began boycotting the tea. Large numbers of colonists began to boycott. And it really brought the colonists together, it unified them, not only just within Massachusetts, but across the board. And so, frustrated with the British Empire, the colonists began to create new sources of authority, committees of correspondence, as it were. But really, before we really get into that, I wanted to show you these primary sources and depictions of the Boston Tea Parties just throwing the tea overboard. They dressed up as Native Americans. It was at night. The only thing they broke was the lock to get onto the ship. They did not harm the ship at all because it was not the ship's fault. Those who owned the ship, not their fault. It was they were trying to punish the British government by dumping all of this tea overboard, and they even replaced the lock and left a note. Very interesting. And there it was around multiple dozens of people. And everyone knew who participated in it, but no one spoke up. This was an act of sticking it to the British government from abroad. And it severely hurt the tea company and the British government. But the owner of those boats, that boat in particular, did not harm him one bit to lose that tea. So now we're going to continue and talk about these intolerable acts. But before we talk into that, we need to really look at these new sources of authority that is going to come about. So frustrated by the British Empire, these colonists are going to begin to create new sources of authority, these committees of correspondence, which I just mentioned. Now, Virginia made the first intercolonial committee of correspondence, which is going to help possible continuous cooperation among the colonies. Multiple colonies are going to start to talk to each other, which had never happened prior to that. They saw themselves as their own entity. And so, after the royal governor dissolves the assembly in 1774, the people declare that the intolerable acts menaced the liberties of every colony. And they issued a call for the Continental Congress. So, what are the intolerable acts? Well, as it shows on this slide, the intolerable acts are laws passed by Britain responding to the Boston Tea Party in 1774. So what do? They close Boston Harbor until the Bostonians pay for the destroyed tea. They restrict the activities of the Massachusetts legislature and gave added powers to the post of governor of Massachusetts. And those powers, in effect, will make him a dictator, to do as he will. And so, this makes the colonists very angry, and this is where they start to get organized. And so, delegates from all colonies but Georgia were present when in September 1774, the First Continental Congress is going to meet in Philadelphia. And at this meeting, they decide to reject a plan for a colonial union under British authority. They are going to endorse a moderate statement of grievances addressed to the king and include a demand for the repeal of all oppressive legislation passed since 1763. So all of those acts we just talked about would be thrown away. They are going to approve a series of resolutions recommending that the military preparations be made for the defense against possible attack by the British troops in Boston, because that's the big port. They're also going to agree to a series of boycotts that they hoped would stop all trade with Great Britain, and they created a Continental Association to see that these agreements were enforced. And then the delegates would meet again the following spring. It's an extremely, extremely significant meeting. It's a big step, and they're starting to make those steps to, if we're not being heard, then maybe what are the next possible steps? And here it is at the First Continental Congress. And here they are signing it. So as you can see, we have North America. We have North Carolina, South Carolina, we have Connecticut, we have New York, Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey. Everyone is pretty much here except for Georgia, of course. Now, there's one last topic I want to discuss, which I don't have a slide for, which is Lexington and Concord. Now, in Boston, General Thomas Gage of the British Army is going to receive orders to arrest rebel leader Sam Adams and John Hancock, who were near Lexington. Now, General Thomas Gage is hesitant until he learns that a large supply of gunpowder is going to be in Concord, 18 miles outside of Boston. And so on April 18th, 1775, he is going to send 1,000 men towards Lexington, hoping to surprise the colonists and seize the illegal supplies without shedding any blood. However, the colonists were watching the British closely, and William Dawes and Paul Revere rode throughout the night to warn villages and farms. Now, while the British arrived in Lexington the next day, several dozen Minutemen, such as Paul Revere is the most famous, but there are actually dozens and dozens of Minutemen riders, met them in the town, in the common area of town. And so the Minutemen were actually fell, and 8 were killed and 10 were wounded by the British Army, these redcoats. And so once arriving at Concord, the British found the colonists had removed most of the powder supply. And so on the way back to Boston, the British are going to be harassed by gunfire of farmers hiding behind trees, rocks, stone walls. And by the end of the day, the British will have lost 3 times as many men as the colonists. And this is as known as the shot heard around the world, and this starts the beginning of the War for Independence. There's a lot happening within this lecture, but there's a lot to come. So remember, as you continue to view these lectures and PowerPoints, remember to look for the overarching theme. What is the big picture that we are looking at when you examine early American history?